Thank you for viewing this American Sewing Guild educational series on creating a faux flat felled seam. A faux flat felled seam can be used anywhere a traditional flat felled seam is used. This seam takes less time to do than a traditional flat felled seam, yet gives the same sort of look. A faux flat felled seam is great for children's play clothes and denim fabrics where a casual look is desired. This seam finish would not be good for sheer or transparent fabrics because the underlying seam would show through. A faux flat felled seam is seen in lesser quality ready-to-wear garments. It is faster to sew and easier to take apart when alterations are needed. In ready-to-wear, many times the seam will be a chain stitch with a serged edge, which is sewn in one step with an industrial serger. Instead of being top stitched down, the seam may be edge stitched in place. This may be done for your projects as well. To create a faux flat felled seam, sew a plain seam. Usually this will be a 5/8 inch seam allowance, but check the pattern instructions. Meld the stitches and press the seam open. Though the seam allowances will come together and be serged, it is still important to press the seam open to get the crisp edge upon which to form the seam. Flip the fabric over and press from the right side. Now press the seam allowances toward the side that they will lay when the seam is finished. This will usually be toward the back side of the garment. Serge the seam allowances together. If you do not have a serger, zigzag or use another stitch on the machine that will mimic the look of a serged edge. Now the seam allowance will be stitched in place to finish the seam. The seam allowance will be top stitched in place. Use a 2.5 or 3 millimeter stitch length. Backstitch at the beginning of the seam. Move the needle position and use the presser foot as a guide when stitching. The top stitching can be anywhere from the seam line. It can be an edge stitch and up to the width of the seam allowance being sewn down. Normally, it is done approximately 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch away from the seam line. Test on scraps of fabric to see what you like best for the project being done. This is also a good time to use those specialty or decorative threads if you want the top stitching to be more pronounced and the stitching to become a feature of the project. On ready-to-wear, many times the seam will be edge stitched in place instead of top stitched. The stitching will go through the top fabric and the serged seam allowance. From the underside, the seam will look like this. And the completed faux flat felled seam from the right side of the project. Edge stitching may also be done along the seam to add another element, and it will make this seam look more like a traditional flat felled seam. Let's watch how to sew a flat felled seam. First you sew a plain seam, meld the stitches and press open, then bring the seam allowances together and serge or otherwise finish the edge. Meld the stitches. Then press the seam allowance toward the direction it will lay once the seam is completed. This will usually be toward the back of the garment. Turn the fabric over and press from the right side. Be sure there are no creases in the seam and that the seam is crisp. The seam allowance will now be sewn down. At the sewing machine, adjust the needle position and use the edge of the presser foot as a guide for evenly top stitching the seam allowance down. The stitching will be done from the top side through the top fabric and seam allowance. backstitch at the end as well as the beginning of the seam. The faux flat felled seam is now complete. Thank you for viewing this American Sewing Guild video. If you have any questions, email Ramona at asg.org. The American Sewing Guild is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to people who believe sewing is a rewarding and creative activity. If you enjoyed this video, join ASG to view our library of in-depth educational videos on various sewing topics. They are free to our members. Members also enjoy discounts from vendors who support our organization, along with many other benefits.